Dr. Zhu, please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Put your hand down.
All right, this will be the deposition of Dr. Andy Zhu, taken for all purposes under the Georgia Civil Practice Act, including for use at trial. I will record the Zoom video and may play that video at trial. Dr. Zhu's been sworn. Could you just please state your name for the record?
Andy Francis Zhu.
All right. And what is your occupation?
Orthopedic surgeon specialized in hand and upper extremity.
All right. And are you licensed to practice medicine in Georgia?
I am.
And was Miss Eileen Friedman your patient?
She was.
All right. And as you know, Ms. Friedman is my client, the plaintiff in this case. My name is Tom Giannotti, the Butler Law Firm. Dr. Zhu, could you just tell us how long you've been an orthopedic surgeon?
I graduated in 2019 and started practice in September of 2019. So at this point, a year and a half. September would mark 2 years.
And do you have an active orthopedic practice in which you see patients throughout the week?
I do.
And are you also on call at times for a trauma center?
I am.
All right. Could you just tell me a bit about your educational background?
Sure. So I got my undergraduate degree at Georgia Tech in biomedical engineering, and then the Medical College of Georgia for my.
I'm sorry, there was a technical difficulty.
Okay. So I got my undergraduate degree at Georgia Tech in biomedical engineering, and I was pre-med there as well. Went on to get my medical degree at Medical College of Georgia. I did a 5-year orthopedic residency program at University of Michigan with an additional 1-year hand fellowship training at Loyola in Chicago.
Okay. And are you board eligible?
Board eligible.
And what does it mean to be board eligible?
So typically, board eligibility requires you to maintain a practice. And then during that period, typically it's within 2 years of graduation, there's a period of time where you collect your cases. Those cases are then submitted to the board, ABOS, the American Board of Orthopedic Surgeons, at which point they review your cases, and then based on the cases, they'll perform an examination for certification. So it takes about 2 years before you can sit for the boards or sit for certification. So currently, I've already submitted all my cases and my application to be board certified, but that process is still ongoing.
Great. So what I'm going to do is share my screen, and I'll pull up what is marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit 52. Do you see this document on the screen, Dr. Zhu?
I do.
And I'm going to scroll through this. This is a 5-page document. But does this appear to be your curriculum vitae?
It does.
All right. I want to tender Plaintiff's Exhibit 52 to evidence.
No objection here.
No objection.
And at this point, we would also tender Dr. Zhu as an expert in the field of orthopedic medicine.
Again, no objection to that.
No objection.
Thanks. And Dr. Zhu, I'll ask you as we talk today about Ms. Friedman for some opinions. And will you give all your opinions to a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
I will.
All right, thank you. So I'd like to now ask you about your treatment of Ms. Friedman. Do you recall how many times you saw Ms. Friedman?
I believe it was a total of 4 visits.
4 visits, okay. And what can you tell us about your initial visit with Ms. Friedman?
So initially she presented to my clinic after a recent injury. At that time, she had a fracture of the distal phalanx of her thumb. The fracture was comminuted and slightly displaced. Based on the alignment of the fracture and the nature of the injury, we decided that this could be treated non-operatively. So initially she was treated in a cast for approximately 2 weeks. I saw her back at that point, which we transitioned her then into a brace. And at that time encouraged to begin range of motion exercises. After that, I believe I followed up with her several weeks, 3 or 4 weeks. I'd have to check the notes to be exact. Later at that point, she was improving using the thumb. And our final follow-up was approximately 2 months after her initial presentation, at which point she was largely pain-free and back to doing most of her activities. So at that point, we encouraged to continue to work on using the thumb and then follow up on an as-needed basis.
And had Ms. Friedman gotten any medical treatment before coming to see you?
She did present to the emergency room where she got treatment there. But prior to that, between emergency room and seeing me, I do not believe she had any other treatment.
Okay. And did you review any records or radiology films at the initial visit?
I did initial visit. Radiology or films were reviewed. I have to double check if we got the initial films or the initial films I reviewed were from the emergency department.
Okay. Well, I'll share my screen again. I'm going to show what's marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit 56. And does this appear to be a true and accurate copy of one of the X-ray images you reviewed?
Yes, that does.
Okay. And is this Ms. Friedman's left or right hand?
This view here is Ms. Friedman's left hand.
Okay. And is that the side of her hand that you just described the injury to her left thumb?
Correct.
Okay. You mentioned a few medical terms. Just want to break down. You said comminuted. What does that mean?
So comminuted typically means that the bone is broken in several spots, so it's more than one piece. And so that usually represents some sort of crush injury or type of more higher trauma injury where there's several parts or several pieces of the bone.
And you mentioned the fracture was displaced to some degree. What does that mean?
The displaced typically means that it's not in its normal anatomic alignment. So there's a little bit of shifting of the bone relative to what a normal bone should appear.
Okay. And I'd like to show another view of the X-ray. This is going to be a Plaintiff's Exhibit 57. Well, actually, strike that. Before I do that, I'd like to tender Plaintiff's Exhibit 56 into evidence.
Objection.
No objection.
Now I'm showing Plaintiff's Exhibit 57. Does this appear to be a true and accurate copy of another one of the X-ray images you reviewed?
It does.
Okay. And is that Ms. Friedman's left thumb?
That is.
Okay. And so the thumb, the tip of her thumb there with the that's shown on the X-ray image, is that are those multiple pieces of bone?
Those are.
Okay. And is that what you mean by, is that what comminuted means?
It is.
Okay. And could you just tell us a bit about well, strike that plaintiff's, I would like to tender Plaintiff's Exhibit 57 into evidence, please.
Objection.
No objection.
All right. And if you would just tell us a bit more about Ms. Friedman's prognosis in terms of her healing. In other words, is she going to have, is her bone going to look the same as it did before the injury?
So overall, in terms of her prognosis, we expect her to be able to return to most activities without any dysfunction. We did discuss that sometimes with these type of fractures, she may still have occasional pain and soreness that comes and goes, but in general, it should not affect her overall function.
While she was healing, did Ms. Friedman report whether her broken thumb affected her daily living?
Initially, so I mean, with use of a cast for a couple of weeks and a brace, it affected daily living in terms of some of the daily household activities. Doing things with the cast definitely inhibits the use of the hand to some degree. And so from that standpoint, a little bit, she still had some pain associated with it as well. But through the course of her treatment, as she improved, she was able to kind of do more and more. So at our last appointment, it seemed like she was able to do most activities with slight discomfort. And at that point, we discussed that the discomfort should continue to improve.
And so does a broken thumb like that normally hurt?
Typically, there is some pain associated with it. Pain is typically worse closer towards the time of the injury. And as the injury begins to heal, pain does improve when she begins working on it in terms of moving the thumb and using it. At first, there's also some soreness and tenderness associated with that as well. But as the injury continues to improve and heal, and as she starts to move it and use it more, pain typically subsides. But again, with some of these injuries, sometimes we'll still have some pains that come and go.
Were there certain things that made Ms. Friedman's pain worse or better that she reported?
I guess, could you clarify what you mean by certain things?
Certain activities that would have made her pain worse or better.
So in terms of, I guess, in the process of healing at first, when we start moving it and using it, that would cause a little bit more discomfort and pain as bones are healing. But usually we get them, it's a balance between getting the patient moving and having stability in the bone. So usually we try having stability first to get the bone stable enough or healed enough so when she does move it, it doesn't shift or move. And so it's a battle between preventing stiffness but still allowing the bone to heal. And so usually after coming out of a cast or after starting to mobilize at first, there's definitely some pain and discomfort associated with that, as bone is still healing. But with time, as that continues to heal, that pain does improve.
Well, before I keep going, I just want to go ahead and show what I've marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit 59, and that's a 25-page document. As I scroll through this document, Dr. Zhu, do these appear to be true and accurate copies of your medical records relating to your treatment of Ms. Friedman?
They do.
Okay. All right, move to tender Plaintiff's Exhibit 59 into evidence.
Are those just records? Is that all we're looking at?
Yes, sir. There are records for Pinnacle Orthopedics.
Well, without sitting here and going through each and every page,
Sure.
I will I'll state that the defendant has no objection to these records being tendered into evidence, subject to any necessary redaction that may be required in the event there is some mention of collateral source, which, staring here at the front page, there is. So no objection, subject to redaction of any collateral source information.
Thank you. And I also want to show Plaintiff's Exhibit 58. This is Dr. Zhu, does this appear to be a true and accurate copy of another X-ray image that you reviewed?
It does.
Okay, and that again is Ms. Friedman's left thumb.
Correct.
And is that that's just a different angle view in the X-ray?
Yes, that is a different angle.
Okay. So going back to the sort of prognosis of Ms. Friedman's injury, when was the last time you saw Ms. Friedman as a patient?
I believe it was on March 12th, 2020.
All right. And did you discuss her medical future with regard to her thumb injury?
At that time, I think our discussion revolved around continuing to use the thumb and trying to get back to her normal activities. I think at that point, she still had some intermittent pain with certain activities that we discussed should continue to improve. We did discuss that, in the future, at times, she may still have some soreness that comes and goes in her thumb, but it shouldn't significantly affect her function moving forward.
All right. And would you expect her to continue to have occasional aches and pains now?
At this point, it wouldn't be uncommon. So I think it definitely would be possible for her to still have some occasional aches and pains. But overall, I would expect her function to be back to normal outside of the occasional aches and pains.
Okay. And would you expect those occasional aches and pains to continue into the future?
In general, everyone's a little bit different. So if someone didn't have occasional aches and pains into the future, I wouldn't say that's uncommon. So I wouldn't necessarily say an expected outcome, but it's also not an uncommon outcome as well. So.
And would you, in terms of, aside from the function, but just cosmetically, appearance-wise, would you expect Ms. Friedman's thumb to appear exactly the same as it did before the injury?
So sometimes with these type of injuries, the thumb sometimes may have a little bit more angulation, depending on how the fracture was. So for her, I believe she still had a little bit of deviation or a little bit of turning, I guess you would say, of her thumb. Sometimes the thumb does remain a little more swollen as well. And so that may be a residual effect. So sometimes the thumb does return to a normal appearance, but sometimes depending on the fracture and the shift in the bones and then the healing, sometimes it will still have some residual changes or deformity.
Okay. And you that residual angulation that you referred to, could you explain what that means in non-medical terms?
Sure. So oftentimes with a fracture, with displacement, the bones shift a little bit. In terms of treatment, we try to decide if that shifting of the bone warrants a surgery for correction or if it will not affect future function. So typically, if that fracture is shifted and we don't feel like it would alter future function, or if we felt like a surgery to perform just for the shifting or for the cosmetic purposes would not bring much benefit to the patient, then we oftentimes select for non-operative treatment. And so there are times where the bone still shifted or not in its anatomic position, and we leave them there, knowing that most evidence shows that it shouldn't affect the function. So sometimes there is still residual deformity.
Okay. And that residual deformity is fair to say that essentially her thumb appears crooked?
Yeah, you could say crooked. So it wouldn't be in this same position or it wouldn't be in a straight position.
Okay. And would you expect her thumb to have that residual angulation if she had not suffered the traumatic injury and broken thumb?
I would not expect her thumb to have any sort of deformity if no injury occurred.
Okay. So, and I would just want to show a couple photos that Ms. Friedman had taken. This is going to be Plaintiff's Exhibit 55. Does this appear to be the same thumb, left thumb that you treated Ms. Friedman for?
It appears to be that way.
And is that appearance, does that appear to represent the residual angulation you referred to in her left thumb?
It does.
Okay. I would tender Plaintiff's Exhibit 55 into evidence.
I'm going to object to that exhibit to the extent I don't believe a proper foundation has been laid for Dr. Zhu to comment on that. There's been no evidence presented to Dr. Zhu as to when that photograph was taken, how close in time to the injury or the treatment that photograph was taken. So on those grounds, I will object.
Okay. And Dr. Zhu, just to summarize your opinions in this case, Is it your opinion that Ms. Friedman will likely have some permanent residual deformity in her left thumb?
Based on the x-rays and her treatment, if that was a picture of her thumb, then I believe that picture, she would have some residual deformity.
Okay. Meaning that her left thumb will likely be bent or appear crooked forever?
Yes. And when the bones heal, they don't heal back on their own in the original position. So I think whatever her deformity or angulation is currently, it will remain that way.
Okay. And is it your opinion that Ms. Friedman may continue to have some occasional aches or pains in her left thumb?
Yeah, I don't, that is correct. I think that is possible.
And is it your opinion that the January 6, 2020 collision caused the injury to Ms. Friedman's thumb?
Based on the information she provided to me at our visit, based on her information provided, that would be the cause of the injury.
Okay. And the injury, is it your opinion that, again, the injury was a comminuted and displaced fracture, her left thumb, meaning that the bone was broken into several pieces?
That is correct.
Okay. And do you, has Ms. Friedman been a good patient?
She's attended all her follow-ups. She attended her therapy visits as well. So I don't have a reason to think she was not.
And do you have any reason to doubt the truth of anything that Ms. Friedman told you?
I do not have any reason to doubt what she told me.
Okay. And is there anything you've wanted to talk about that, or think that we should talk about today that I haven't asked?
No, there's nothing I can think of.
Okay. And have all the opinions you've given today been to a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
They have been.
Okay. Well, thank you for your time, Doctor. That's all the questions I have, but the other lawyers may have some questions for you.
Sure.
Good morning, Dr. Zhu. We're still before noon, so I'll say good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Jim Taylor. I'm the attorney representing the defendant in this case, and I've got some questions for you. I apologize. I'm going to be jumping around a bit. I try and keep it as linear as I can, but sometimes that's just impossible for me. So the last time you saw Ms. Friedman was on March 12 of 2020. That's right?
Yes.
She hasn't been back to see you since then, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, all right. And on that final visit of March 12, 2020, did you discharge her from your care?
I did.
Did you instruct her that she could always come back to see you in the future if she was having problems?
I did. I typically tell the patients that they may follow up on an as-needed basis after the discharge.
All right. And you haven't seen her since that visit, correct?
I have not, no.
Have you talked with her since that final visit?
I do not believe I have any direct contact with her.
So as we're sitting here today, do you know anything about Ms. Friedman's condition since that final visit?
Since her final visit, I have not had any updates from her about her final condition.
Okay, because you testified that there was possible residual angulation. It was possible she would have occasional aches and pains in the future, but those were all just possibilities, correct?
The aches and pains, yes. The deformity, she still had a little bit on exam during her visit. So her thumb has always been slightly angulated based both on the x-rays and the exams from before, but I have not seen her since that 3/12/20 visit. And in terms of the possible aches and pains, I do not know if she currently is having aches and pains. We just discussed that may be a possibility.
Sure. And just to be sure, prior to January 9 of 2020, you had never treated or seen Ms. Friedman, is that correct?
That is correct.
So is it accurate or fair to say that prior to that initial visit of January 9, 2020, you don't know what the condition of the tip of her thumb was?
That is correct. I had not seen her prior to that, so I did not know what her thumb looked like before. The x-rays it looked like were taken on 1/6/2020, so those were the ones I reviewed from the emergency room.
Okay. Now, no surgery was performed to, shall we say, address the fracture, correct?
Correct. Correct.
It was treated essentially through immobilization. And is that a common way that you would treat an injury such as this?
Her particular injury, yes, that is a common way we typically treat those injuries.
And is immobilization a common way of treating this type of injury because essentially the soft tissue surrounding the bone is sufficient to hold the fracture in place for healing purposes?
Both the soft tissue and the cast mobilization. The goal of that is to immobilize and to help stabilize the fracture as it heals a little bit more before getting her moving or getting a patient moving.
And based upon the x-rays that you reviewed, as well as your actual observation of Ms. Friedman's thumb, again, just to be clear and just to be certain, there were no bones sticking out, like protruding through the skin, correct?
Correct. It was not an open fracture. Bones sticking out through the skin typically are termed an open fracture.
In your opinion, based upon your observations of Ms. Friedman, the x-rays, any other records you may have seen, at any point in time during the course of your treatment of her, did you have any concerns that she may ultimately lose the tip of her thumb?
Throughout the course of the treatment, I did not have concerns that she would lose the tip of her thumb.
Was any surgery ever discussed with Ms. Friedman during the course that she treated with you?
We didn't really touch base on any surgery at that time. There was not an indication for surgery, so we didn't really go into possible surgery or surgical treatment options.
Now, I've reviewed your records and they've been tendered into evidence subject to certain objections, but your records discuss the IP joint.
Correct.
Can you tell the jury what is the IP joint and where is it located with respect to this particular injury?
So her particular injury was in her distal phalanx. The thumb typically has two phalanges, a distal and a proximal. When we talk about an interphalangeal joint, it's the joint in between the two phalanges. So in the case of the thumb, there's only one interphalangeal joint. And so typically that's termed the IP joint. And so for her, her IP joint would be between her distal phalanx, which is where her fracture occurred, and her proximal phalanx.
And to dumb it down for people like me, are we talking about the joint that's I guess immediately below the thumbnail?
Correct. That would be correct.
All right. And when you saw her on that initial visit, was she able to manipulate that joint?
I believe she was able to wiggle it a little bit, and we usually test that to test if the tendons are intact or not.
Your records indicate that even though the fracture was comminuted, that Ms. Friedman did have independent flexion and extension of the IP joint, and the joint remains congruent.
Correct.
Can you translate that into layman's terms for us?
Sure. So usually when we talk about a joint, we talk about the interface between two bones. So you can think of it as kind of like a ball and socket where the ball articulates with the socket. When we talk about fractures, we also want to see if they involve the joint or not, because if they involve the joint, that means that then involves the articulation between two bones. And so kind of in layman's terms, it's almost like an area where there's movement. If there's natural movement in between two areas, we want to know if that fracture gets into that area or that zone. If it does, then we have to see if that fracture is displaced or shifted in that area. If there's a shifted in an area where there's movement, then there's concern that with movement, there can be wearing away of the cartilage or the joint. And so that predisposes to arthritis and pain. So when looking at a fracture, we try to decide if that fracture extends into the joint, which means if it affects the joint.
And in Ms. Friedman's situation, was that in fact the case? Did that fracture extend into the joint?
Her fracture did not appear to extend into the joint. Her IP joint was still congruent. And that is also one of the factors in deciding whether or not surgery is indicated or not.
What about any indication of nerve damage? Was there any indication based upon your examination and observations that Ms. Friedman had sustained any type of nerve damage in the tip of her thumb?
So it's difficult to say when you say nerve damage. Typically by the level of the thumb or the pulp of the finger, your nerves have spread and arborized or spread. So essentially what that means is you have two nerves that go across the finger that give sensation along the entire length of the finger. If you think of the nerves as a cable or a rope, it's a very distinct cable and rope going up to the finger. By the time it reaches that IP joint or the distal portion of the thumb, it's almost spread out, almost kind of like roots. So there's not per se a laceration or a cut of one of the nerves, but a high trauma or a crush injury can definitely damage the nerve endings. And so there's not a nerve per se to repair, but the crushed nerve endings can be damaged or injured.
Were they damaged or injured in Ms. Friedman's case?
So in her case, in terms of nerve damage and injury on the tip of the fingers, most of the times what it manifests as is decreased sensation or increased sensitivity. So in general, with a crush injury like that, there typically is some injury to the nerve. There's no real test to say, was that nerve cut or crushed or damaged? There's no way to test the tip when it's that small. But in general, with the swelling, with decreased sensation, with the pain, that's all kind of indicative of nerve injury to some degree.
And so the jury is clear about this. This fracture that we've been discussing was limited to what I will call the tip of the left thumb, correct?
So it was limited to the distal phalanx.
Okay, that area that's generally around where the thumbnail would be. I mean, that's the upper portion of the thumb that we're talking about.
So yeah, that would include the whole area of the nail. The distal phalanx does include that whole area of the nail.
And I've seen some literature. I guess technically you would refer to that area as the tuft. Is that correct?
Sometimes it is referred to as the tuft. That is correct.
Okay. In the course of your practice, how frequently do you see this type of injury?
It's hard to put a number onto it. 90 to 95% of my practice is upper extremity, so elbow down. But we do see a variety of different injuries to the distal phalanx, whether it be a laceration injury, a crush injury, a table saw injury. We do see a fair amount. It'd be hard to quantify, and I couldn't give you a percentage off the top of my head.
Well, is this type of what you've described as crush injury, is it a fairly common injury?
I would say overall, in terms of injuries to the distal phalanx or the phalanges of the fingers, yes, it is one of the more common injuries.
All right. And I by no means am suggesting that the injury to Ms. Friedman's thumb was the result of some other incident. But is this the type of injury you might expect to see, for example, if somebody slammed their thumb in the car door by accident?
This type of fracture pattern could be seen in that type of injury.
Okay, all right. Your final notes of March 12 of 2020 indicate that, well, I'll just read it verbatim. She has clinically healed her injury. What does that mean?
So in general, when we say clinically healed, it means that she is largely pain-free and back to doing most of her activities. In terms of healing, there's typically two types. There's clinical and radiographic. So radiographic healing usually requires demonstration of all the bones mending together and having union, or healing of fracture. Healing in that sense on x-rays typically takes a lot longer, on the orders of months, just because on x-rays, in order to see healing of the bone, mineralization of the bone has to occur. The steps of healing process typically first, the fracture heals, and then later the bone gets mineralized. So later, only later does it show up on x-rays. So typically when treating patients, when they're clinically feeling better and having less pain and back to doing their activities, usually that's when we let the patients go, because in order to bring them back just to get x-rays when we're not doing any additional treatment, doesn't really change the treatment management for the patient. And so that would just be bring the patient back just for x-rays to ensure healing. And that's why we usually say follow up on an as-needed basis when we feel like they've healed enough, or we think that they are going to go ahead and get back to their normal activities, normal life. If they have issues, then they come back, at which point we get additional x-rays. But in general, we don't necessarily always follow up patients until the bones have healed on x-rays.
And I guess my final question for you, what is meant by an interval fracture displacement?
So usually when I say interval, in terms of that means time frame. So if there hasn't been an interval change, usually we follow the x-rays from time to time to see if there's been any displacement. So the interval between the last x-ray and the current x-ray, based on that, it's, if I say no interval displacement, I haven't seen any shifting of the fracture between that time. And that's another reason why we often get x-rays at follow-up visits. Sometimes it's to track the healing to see if there's any extra bone that's been mineralized or been put down, but oftentimes it's also to see if the fracture has shifted positions. So no interval healing or no interval displacement just means from that x-ray to the previous x-ray, there hasn't been a shift in the bones.
And on that final visit of March 12, 2020, you in fact noted that the x-rays demonstrated no evidence of interval fracture displacement. Is that correct?
I believe so. I'd have to check the notes specifically for exactly what I wrote, but that does sound correct.
Okay. Thank you, doctor. That's all I have for you.
I don't have any questions. Thank you.
Thanks. And just briefly redirecting, Dr. Zhu, we've heard some questions by the defendant's attorney by this time. Have any of your opinions changed?
No, they have not.
Okay. Thank you. That's all I have.
Nothing else.
All right. Thank you for your time, doctor.
All right, thank you.
Oh, wait, before he leaves, do you want to explain reading and waiving?
Yes, thank you for reminding me. Dr. Zhu, you can choose to waive signature, meaning you don't have to read over the deposition and sign it in front of a notary, or you can choose to read and sign the transcript.
I could waive
Thank
this
you.
signing.
All right.
Would you like this transcribed?
Yes, please.
Mr. Taylor, would you like a copy?
Yes, please.
And Michelle?
Yes, I'd like a copy too, an E-Tran, please.